The deep void of space, once a silent and unforgiving abyss, had witnessed the most extraordinary of journeys. For years, the Black Ship, the infamous vessel that vanished without a trace, remained nothing more than a legend. Stories whispered among the stars spoke of its eerie disappearance, its crew lost to the cosmic unknown. But just as quickly as it was forgotten, an unexpected signal surged from the cold, distant corners of human space, one that sent shockwaves through every communication hub, igniting a sense of dread and anticipation. It was a distress signal, carrying with it an eerie resonance that seemed almost too familiar. And then, through the crackling noise of 1,000 galaxies, came a voice. A voice from the past. It was the voice of Wyatt, the captain of the Black Ship, a man whose name had been erased from the records, whose fate had remained a mystery. His voice, however, now carried something else. It was altered, warped by time, but still unmistakably human. It wasn't just a message, a simple plea for help. No. It was something far darker. The crew that answered the call would soon discover that Wyatt's mind had not vanished into oblivion. It had endured. And it had changed. The crew that set out to investigate the source of the distress signal was no ordinary team of explorers. They were seasoned, hardened by years of navigating the farthest reaches of human space. But nothing could have prepared them for the unsettling reality they would uncover. As their ship drew closer to the coordinates transmitted by Wyatt's signal, an unshakable unease settled over them. What they had expected to find was a wreck, a tomb in space, perhaps a ghost ship floating among the debris of a forgotten civilization. What they didn't expect was the Black Ship itself intact, orbiting an isolated planet at the edge of known space. The crew sensors failed to pick up anything out of the ordinary. No signs of life. No threats. But as they boarded the Black Ship, a chill swept over them, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the ship. It was as though the vessel itself had been waiting for them. It didn't take long for them to realize that something was horribly wrong. The ship wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. Or, at the very least, it seemed to pulse with a strange, almost sentient energy. Wyatt's voice guided them through the eerie corridors, but it wasn't just the familiar commands of a captain now lost to time. His words were disjointed, fractured, as though his mind had been torn apart and stitched back together. This way, the voice urged them through the static, urging them to follow. The truth is waiting. But you must understand. The price. There were pauses, long moments of silence that were filled with a palpable sense of dread, as though Wyatt himself were struggling to maintain his grip on whatever remained of his humanity. The crew pushed forward, each step taking them deeper into the heart of the Black Ship, unaware of the horrors they were about to awaken. They discovered the ship's logs, cryptic and corrupted, detailing the final days of the crew's journey. The entries spoke of a strange phenomenon encountered deep within a forgotten part of space, something that had changed them, something that had altered their perception of reality. But the most chilling entry was the last one, written in Wyatt's own hand. I can hear them now. They're here. I don't know how long I can keep them out. The crew found no bodies, no remains of the Black Ship's original crew. It was as though they had simply disappeared. But there were subtle traces that suggested otherwise. The walls of the ship were scarred with strange symbols, marks that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy of their own. And then, as they made their way deeper into the ship, they found something even more disturbing. A chamber, hidden deep within the ship's core, where the air felt thick, almost oppressive. It was here that they discovered Wyatt, or at least, what was left of him. His body was no longer human, but his mind remained. A strange, glowing structure had replaced what once was a man, and from within this dark, mechanical cocoon came the faintest whisper of his voice. I've been waiting for you, it said, barely audible, but unmistakably Wyatt's. I've been waiting for someone to hear me. What was left of Wyatt's mind was still trapped in this dark, alien vessel, altered by whatever had consumed the ship all those years ago. The crew now faced a terrifying decision. Should they attempt to bring him back, to free him from whatever had taken over his mind? Or should they leave him to whatever fate had become his? The unknown force that had changed Wyatt, that had twisted him into something unrecognizable, still loomed in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the crew prepared to make their choice, the voice of Wyatt echoed once more, but this time, there was something different in his tone. "They're coming. You don't understand yet. You never will. Until it's too late." The air grew colder. The shadows deeper. And the crew knew, with a sinking feeling in their hearts, that they were no longer alone on the black ship. What had happened to Wyatt? What had he become? And what was it that still lingered within the dark heart of the ship? The answers were just out of reach, hidden somewhere in the depths of space, and the crew was about to find out that the price for those answers might be higher than they could ever imagine. And then, silence. The ship's power flickered. The voice stopped. And in the silence, something stirred. Would they find the truth before it was too late? Or would they become the next echoes, lost to the vast, unfeeling void of space? The eerie silence that followed Wyatt's final warning settled over the crew like a thick, suffocating fog. Every footstep echoed through the desolate halls of the black ship, the hum of the ship's ancient machinery the only sound that seemed to pierce the stillness. The crew had stopped moving, frozen in place, their eyes scanning the darkened corridors as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. In the moment that the voice stopped, the ship seemed to hold its breath. The faint glow of the emergency lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. No one dared speak, not even to acknowledge the growing knot of tension in their chests. They were acutely aware of their isolation. There was no rescue coming. No backup. They were alone on this forsaken vessel, cut off from the rest of human space. The voice of Wyatt, distorted and haunting, had been their only guide thus far. But now that it had fallen silent, they were left in the dark. The ship had no clear destination. No map. No markers. They were navigating through a forgotten tomb of metal and circuitry, and with each step, they felt themselves slipping further into its grasp. Whatever had happened to Wyatt and his crew all those years ago, it was clear that something had changed the very essence of the black ship. It was no longer just a vessel, it was something alive, and it had been waiting for them. But waiting for what? The crew had been trained to face danger, to meet the unknown with logic and cold, calculated responses. But this was different. There were no protocols for this kind of fear, this kind of mystery. The unknown force that lurked aboard the black ship seemed beyond comprehension. It was as if the ship itself had become a sentient being, one that was aware of their presence and determined to manipulate them, to draw them deeper into its web. They had come looking for answers, seeking to uncover the fate of the black ship's lost crew. But now, they weren't sure if they were ready for the truth. What if they weren't supposed to find answers? What if some things were better left undisturbed, buried in the forgotten reaches of space? One of the crew members, a veteran navigator, finally broke the silence. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. "This place. It's not right. We've overstayed our welcome." Another crew member, the ship's engineer, scoffed and turned to her. "We're not leaving without knowing what happened here. If we leave now, it's all for nothing. We've come too far to turn back." But the navigator didn't seem convinced. She had been the first to sense the ship's unsettling atmosphere when they had boarded. The walls, the air, even the very gravity felt wrong, unnatural. Something was off. And every instinct in her body screamed that they should leave, that they should get back to the safety of their ship and never look back. But, like the others, she was trapped in a mission, bound by duty. They couldn't turn back now. As they continued forward, the ship seemed to close in on them. The walls, once sterile and cold, now pulsed with an unsettling warmth. The metal beneath their feet felt alive, shifting ever so slightly, as if the black ship were aware of their every move. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into its labyrinthine structure, where nothing was what it seemed. And still, Wyatt's voice, though faint, lingered in their minds, its disjointed echoes the only guide they had left. Through the door, Wyatt had said, before the silence. The answers are through the door. It was the only clue they had. Through the door. They found the door at the end of a narrow, twisting corridor. Its surface was covered in strange symbols patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on where they stood. The crew had no idea what the markings meant, but they could feel the weight of their significance. It was as if the door itself held the answers they sought, answers that had been locked away for so long. As they approached, the temperature inside the corridor dropped sharply, and a soft hum resonated from the door, as if it were alive. The navigator hesitated. She looked at the others, her heart racing in her chest. "We shouldn't open it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know what's on the other side." The ship's captain, a no-nonsense leader who had seen countless missions to the furthest reaches of space, took a deep breath. "We're not turning back now," he said. "We've come too far. Whatever's in there, we need to see it." With a steady hand, he reached for the door's control panel, his fingers trembling just slightly. As soon as he touched it, the door clicked open, revealing what lay beyond. A room unlike any other they had seen. The walls were lined with strange, organic-looking structures that pulsed with an eerie glow. There were no visible windows, no visible doors, only darkness beyond the pale light. And in the center of the room, a single, massive structure stood, an apparatus that seemed to be both part machine and part something else entirely. It was as though the ship had grown around it, had molded itself to accommodate this strange device. It seemed alien, but it also felt familiar. Almost as though it had always been a part of the Black Ship, just waiting to be discovered. And in front of the device, standing motionless, was a figure. A man. Or, at least, something that once was. The crew gasped in unison. It was Wyatt. Or, what was left of him. His body was suspended in a complex, metallic harness, wires and cables running into his skin, his eyes closed, his face gaunt and pale. His mouth was slightly open, as though he had been speaking, but no sound came from him now. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath labored and uneven, as though he were struggling to stay alive. His presence was chilling, unnatural. He looked trapped, but also strangely peaceful. But as they stepped closer, the faintest hint of movement caught their attention. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment, the crew thought they saw something more than just a man in that stare. There was something dark, something ancient in those eyes, a knowledge that had never been meant for human minds. The engineer was the first to speak. "What is this? What happened to him?" "I don't know," the captain murmured. He stepped closer to the suspended form of Wyatt, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to get him out. We need to bring him back." The voice of Wyatt, though distorted, crackled to life once more, but this time, it was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, a force that filled the room with an oppressive weight. "You don't understand," it said, the words barely intelligible. "You can't bring me back. I never left." A chill ran down the crew's spines. The voice was no longer the familiar sound of their captain. It was something else. Something that had taken hold of him. "What do you mean?" one of the crew members asked, but Wyatt's eyes flickered again, his gaze locking onto theirs with an intensity that felt almost suffocating. And then, with a final, guttural whisper, he spoke one last time, "It's already too late." The lights in the room began to flicker wildly, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The temperature dropped further, the air becoming thick and stifling, as though someone else was in the room with them. Something that had been watching them all along. The crew turned toward the door, but before they could move, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned and shook, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The Black Ship wasn't just alive. It was awakening. And it wasn't about to let them leave. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the doors slammed shut behind them. And in that moment, they knew, whatever had happened to Wyatt, whatever force had claimed him, was far from finished. And they were next. The room was suddenly bathed in a pulse of crimson light as the ship seemed to come alive around them. The walls groaned and shifted, the low hum of its ancient machinery escalating into an ominous whine. The crew stood frozen, each one desperately trying to grasp what was happening, but their minds couldn't keep up with the sheer terror that was unfolding. The air was thick with a coldness that felt unnatural, a force that seemed to press in on them from every direction. The black ship wasn't just alive, it was something more, something ancient that they had never imagined could exist. The captain tried to force the door open, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the controls, but nothing worked. The door wouldn't budge. It was as though the ship had sealed them in, trapped them in this nightmare with no way out. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. But the words felt hollow, lost in the rising chaos around them. Suddenly, a voice echoed throughout the room, not from Wyatt, but from the ship itself. The voice was deep, resonating with a dark power that seemed to rattle their bones. "You should never have come here," it whispered, the words lingering in the cold air. "You are not meant to know." A feeling of dread swept over the crew, and they all turned toward Wyatt, or what was left of him. His eyes, once lifeless, were now wide open, staring directly at them. His face was twisted in agony, the wires and cables that once connected him to the ship now sparking with an unnatural energy. But it wasn't just Wyatt, they could feel it. The ship had become a living entity, feeding off something far darker than they could comprehend. "Get away from him!" the navigator yelled, backing away from the device that had once contained Wyatt. But it was too late. The transformation had already begun. Wyatt's body convulsed violently, his limbs jerking and twitching as the ship's power surged through him. His voice, now twisted and unnatural, boomed out once more. "I told you! It's already too late." The crew watched in horror as Wyatt's form shifted before their eyes. His body was no longer that of a man. The ship had fused with him, his flesh and metal melding together into something grotesque, a dark amalgamation of man and machine. The very air seemed to vibrate with energy, the ship's core resonating with a deep, primal hum. It was as if the black ship was feeding on Wyatt's transformation, growing stronger with each passing second. The once human captain was now something far more terrifying. The navigator, her voice trembling, looked at the captain. "We need to get to the escape pods. Now. It's our only chance." But the captain was no longer listening. His eyes were fixed on Wyatt, no, on the creature that had replaced him, and he seemed to be drawn in by some unseen force. "This isn't just about Wyatt anymore," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's about the ship. This place. It's a gateway. And it's opening." The ship shook violently again, and the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness for a split second. The crew scrambled to stay upright, but when the lights returned, the room had changed. The walls were no longer smooth metal, they had shifted, warped, like living tissue. The symbols etched into the walls now pulsed with a sickly, glowing light, their patterns shifting and changing as though they were alive. The ship was feeding on their fear, evolving in ways they couldn't understand. The very architecture was bending and twisting around them, as if the black ship itself was alive, breathing, waiting. The air was thick with the sound of something moving just beyond their reach, something unseen, lurking in the shadows. The navigator's breath came in short gasps as she scanned the room, her hand shaking as she reached for her weapon. "We can't stay here. We have to find a way out," she said, her voice strained. But as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with an audible clang. The ship was no longer just trapping them, it was hunting them. They could feel it now, a presence, something ancient and malevolent that had been waiting for them to arrive. The black ship had always been more than just a vessel. It had been designed for something else, something far darker. And now, the crew was at the mercy of whatever force lay within it. The captain, still fixated on Wyatt's twisted form, stepped forward. "We can't escape. Not from this. The ship won't let us." His voice was almost reverent, as if he were speaking to something greater than himself. He was no longer the man they had known, but something else, something consumed by the ship's influence. His eyes glowed with an eerie light, a reflection of the power that had begun to take hold of him. "Captain, no!" the navigator shouted, but it was too late. The captain's hand reached out to touch the creature that had once been Wyatt, and as his fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy exploded from the body, sending a shockwave that knocked the crew off their feet. The ship's hum intensified, now deafening, and the walls shook with violent tremors. It felt as though the entire vessel was coming apart. And yet, at the same time, it was somehow growing. The black ship was no longer just a machine, it was a living, breathing entity, and it was feeding off their presence, growing stronger with each passing second. It was as if the ship itself were a parasite, feeding on the life force of those who dared enter its domain. And then, the creature that had once been Wyatt spoke again, but this time, it wasn't in his voice. It was in a multitude of voices, a chorus of whispers that filled the room, their words twisted and garbled, impossible to understand. "You should never have come," the voices whispered, "you are the next. The final part of the puzzle." The creature's eyes opened once more, but this time, they weren't Wyatt's eyes. They were something else entirely, something ancient, something that had been waiting for eons. The crew could feel it now, there was no escape. The black ship was not just a machine, it was a sentient entity, one that had been waiting for them to arrive. And it would not let them leave. They were trapped in its grasp. The doors had sealed shut. The walls were alive, pulsing with energy. The creature, the amalgamation of Wyatt and the ship, was growing, its power feeding off their fear, feeding off the very life force of the crew. And as the whispers grew louder, the crew realized the terrible truth: they weren't just trapped in the black ship. They were being absorbed, piece by piece, into its dark heart. The ship had taken Wyatt, twisted him into something else, and now it was coming for them. The navigator reached for her communicator, but the signal was gone. Nothing worked. No connection. No hope. The ship was closing in. And the only thing left was the sound of the creature's whisper, growing louder, its cold, inhuman voice filling the room. "You are the final part," it said, and in that moment, the crew realized with a terrible certainty that they were not just prisoners, they were sacrifices. The room was alive with a tension that felt almost suffocating. The crew stood at the center of the black ship's pulsating heart, helpless and trapped as the walls closed in, their once pristine metal now a mass of writhing, living tissue. The whispers of the creature that had once been Wyatt became deafening, echoing through their minds like a chorus of distant, forgotten voices. It was no longer just a ship, no longer just a place. The black ship had become something far worse, an ancient, malevolent force that was using them, feeding on them, pulling them into its dark web. The creature's eyes, now a sickly, glowing yellow, flickered with a disturbing light. It was neither human nor machine, but an amalgamation of both. It seemed to study them, waiting, its twisted form undulating with unnatural energy. Its voice had become a roar in their heads, a constant barrage of thoughts and images that they couldn't escape. "You are the final part," it repeated, the words reverberating like a death knell. "The last piece of the puzzle. Together, we will awaken the ship. And the universe will bow." The crew could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing in on them, dragging them closer to some unspeakable end. They had come here seeking answers, but all they had found was an ancient evil that had waited centuries to be freed. It had taken Wyatt. It had taken their captain. Now, it was coming for them. But even as the creature loomed closer, there was something else, something that had remained dormant within them all along. A faint spark of resistance, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. The navigator was the first to react. With a shaking hand, she reached for her weapon, her knuckles white against the cold metal of the gun's handle. Her voice trembled, but there was fire in her eyes. "We're not letting you take us," she said, her voice a growl. "Not without a fight." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, but before the creature could respond, the walls of the ship seemed to surge in response. The lights flickered violently, and the ground beneath their feet trembled as though the ship itself were waking up. The black ship was no longer just a vessel, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had begun to fight back against its own captor. A sudden, piercing scream echoed through the room, and the crew turned to see their captain, the man they had once trusted, now fully consumed by the ship's power. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his body jerked and convulsed as though his very soul was being ripped from him. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice ragged. "You cannot stop it. No one can." But the navigator wouldn't back down. "We can't stop it. But we can damn sure try," she muttered through gritted teeth. She stepped forward, lifting her weapon as the rest of the crew followed suit. They had nothing left to lose, no more options. They were facing something beyond their understanding, but they were human, and that meant they still had a will to survive. As they advanced, the ship seemed to react, its walls shifting and bending around them. But even as the black ship closed in, they pushed forward, determined to face whatever lay ahead. And then, in an instant, everything went silent. The creature, the amalgamation of Wyatt and the black ship, stopped moving. Its form froze, suspended in mid-air as if time itself had stopped. The crew hesitated, their weapons still raised, eyes scanning the stillness. They had no idea what was happening, but they knew better than to trust the silence. Without warning, the ship's central core exploded with a surge of energy. A wave of force ripped through the room, sending the crew crashing to the ground. The air was filled with a cacophony of noise, screeches, groans, and the unsettling sound of metal grinding against metal. The walls buckled and twisted, but the crew didn't dare move. Through the chaos, a figure emerged from the swirling mass of energy. Wyatt. But not the Wyatt they had known. His body was now fully transformed, his once human form barely recognizable. His eyes were black pits, and his skin was twisted and scorched. He was a creature of pure darkness, something that had shed all semblance of humanity. And yet, there was a flicker of something familiar within him, something that called out to them, a memory of the man he had once been. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and powerful, echoing through the ship. "The ship has chosen," it intoned, the words vibrating in their bones. "You are the final offering. The last piece." For a moment, the crew stood in stunned silence, the weight of the words settling over them like a shroud. The black ship was alive, and it had chosen them for something far darker than they could have ever imagined. Then, just as quickly as the silence had come, it was shattered by a deafening roar. The ship shook violently, and the walls cracked open, revealing a blinding light that seemed to stretch out into infinity. The black ship was tearing itself apart, its metal framework groaning and screeching as though it were being pulled in every direction at once. "Run!" the navigator screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. But it was too late. The light expanded, consuming everything in its path. The crew tried to flee, but the force of the explosion was too much. The ship's control systems were gone, and the energy of the core had become unstable. There was no escape. And then, in the final moments before everything was consumed by the blinding light, the creature Wyatt turned toward them. His eyes were wide, but there was something in them. A flicker of recognition. A last, desperate attempt to hold onto the man he had once been. "You cannot leave," he whispered, his voice a fading echo. "Not now. Not ever." The room exploded in light and sound. And then silence. When the crew awoke, they found themselves in the wreckage of the black ship, but the ship itself was gone. Only fragments remained, scattered across the void of space. The stars above them gleamed with an eerie calm, as if nothing had ever happened. But something was wrong. They had survived, yes. But in the distance, they could see it, a shape, barely visible against the blackness of space. Something moving, shifting in the dark. It was faint, but unmistakable. The black ship was gone, but its presence had not been erased. It lingered out there, somewhere, waiting. And though they had escaped, they knew one thing for certain: the black ship was far from finished. It would return. And when it did, there would be nowhere left to run. The debris of the black ship floated silently in the vast emptiness of space. The once mighty vessel, now reduced to jagged remnants and fractured metal, drifted through the void like a ghost, a hollow shell of its former self. The crew, disoriented but alive, floated in the wreckage, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The blinding explosion, the harrowing transformation of Wyatt, and the ship's cataclysmic destruction, none of it felt real. It was as if they were suspended in a nightmare, trapped between the realm of the living and the unimaginable. But they were alive, and that was the only thing that kept them grounded. The navigator, still gasping for breath, scanned the horizon. Her pulse was erratic, her mind reeling from the enormity of what had occurred. She had thought they were all doomed, that there was no escaping the grasp of the black ship, but here they were, floating in the cold, empty void. There was no sign of the creature that had once been Wyatt, no trace of the malevolent force that had controlled the ship. Just silence. A terrifying, oppressive silence. They had managed to escape the black ship's collapse, but at what cost? They had lost their captain, their crewmates, and their sense of safety. The navigator felt a chill run down her spine as she thought about what they had left behind. The black ship had consumed them, twisted their minds and bodies, and left them scarred emotionally and physically. And yet, they had survived. For now. But the question lingered, unspoken among them all: had they truly escaped? Or was the black ship still out there, watching, waiting? "We need to regroup," the navigator said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "We can't stay here. We need to get back to human space." The others nodded, but there was no urgency in their movements. They were still shaken, still trying to process the surreal horrors they had witnessed. The engineer, whose hands were still trembling, checked their supplies. "The communication systems are down. We'll need to manually repair them if we want to make contact." It was a daunting task, but it was their only option. They needed to find a way to send a distress signal, to make sure they were found before they drifted into the abyss of space forever. As the navigator and the engineer worked together to repair the ship's communication systems, the rest of the crew hovered in the background, lost in their thoughts. It was clear that none of them were the same as they had been before the mission. The horrors of the black ship had left an indelible mark on them. The creature that had once been Wyatt had been the physical embodiment of the ship's malevolent influence, but the real damage had been done to their minds. Each of them had witnessed things that defied explanation, things that could never be erased from their memories. They had come in search of answers, but what they had found instead was something far worse than they had imagined. Hours passed. The crew worked in silence, their movements mechanical, as they slowly pieced together the ship's broken systems. The navigator focused on the task at hand, but in the back of her mind, the question remained: what had happened to the black ship? Why had it been destroyed? And what of Wyatt? It wasn't until they finally re-established a weak signal that the answer began to reveal itself. The transmission came through, faint at first, like a whisper across the emptiness. It was a strange mix of static and distorted voices, a series of words that sent chills down their spines. "The black ship, it's not gone." The crew froze. The voice on the other end was distorted, unrecognizable, but the words were clear enough. The black ship wasn't gone. It was still out there. And it was still coming for them. The navigator's heart raced as she scrambled to enhance the signal. "Who is this?" she demanded. "Who's out there?" The response was fragmented, broken by static, but it was unmistakable. "The ship, it chose you. You're the key. The ship has awakened." The word sent a shockwave of fear through the crew. The ship had awakened? The black ship had never been just a machine, it had been something more. It had always been waiting for this moment. And now, with the crew's survival, it had achieved something it had been striving toward for eons. The navigator's hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "What do you mean, we're the key?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Who are you?" The voice on the other end flickered, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, slowly, the voice returned, now more coherent. The black ship is not just a ship. It is a vessel, a gateway to something far greater. The ship has chosen you to bring it into the next phase. You've already begun the process. There's no turning back. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the crew in stunned silence. The words hung in the air like a dark omen, their meaning too horrifying to fully grasp. The navigator turned to the others, her face pale. "We've made a terrible mistake," she whispered. "We thought we were escaping, but the truth is, we've only just begun." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. They had thought they had won. They had believed the black ship had been destroyed, that they had broken free. But the truth was far more disturbing. The ship wasn't just a weapon or a machine, it was a living, breathing entity. And they were its instruments, its chosen ones. Whether they liked it or not, they had become part of its dark design. The navigator's mind raced. What had they unleashed? What did the ship's awakening mean for the future? And most importantly, how could they stop it? They had survived the horrors of the black ship's interior, but they had no idea what awaited them now. The creature that had once been Wyatt, the twisted fusion of man and machine, had been just the beginning. The ship's true power lay in its ability to manipulate and control, its ability to bend the will of those who came into contact with it. And now, the crew was connected to it in ways they couldn't yet understand. "We need to get back to human space," the navigator repeated, her voice firm but weary. "We need to warn them." But deep down, she knew it was too late. The black ship had already begun its next phase. It was no longer just a ship, it was a force, a power that was beyond human comprehension. And the universe would never be the same again. As they drifted in the wreckage of the black ship, the crew knew one thing for certain: they had unleashed something that they could not control. The ship had chosen them, and now it was up to them to face the consequences. But they weren't ready. They weren't prepared for the darkness that lay ahead. And somewhere, in the depths of space, the black ship waited, its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. It was patient, and it would not be denied. The crew had thought they had escaped. But in truth, the black ship had only just begun to make its move. The question now was, how long would it be before they became part of the ship's eternal design? And what, exactly, had they unleashed on the universe? As the cold emptiness of space swallowed them, the crew could only wait, uncertain of what the future held, but knowing one thing for certain: the black ship's story was far from over.